welcome to NAA Insights, MHN's quarterly podcast series that brings you the latest from the National Apartment Association. I'm Senior Editor Laura Valean, and today we'll be taking a closer look at NAA's Dollar of Rent tool, an interactive resource designed to bring more transparency to how rent dollars are actually spent across the rental housing industry. Joining me today is Leah Cuffy, Director of Advocacy Research, who will share details about why this tool was created, what the data reveals about operating costs and margins, and how you, as an owner or property manager, can use it to communicate more clearly about the realities of running apartment communities. Leah, welcome to the podcast. I'm really glad to have you back.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for inviting me back. It's really good to speak with you again and always a pleasure to have a conversation with you.
So before we get into how this tool actually works, let's just talk a bit about the problem that NAA was trying to solve when it created this dollar of rent tool. What were you hearing from members or policymakers that signaled a gap in understanding?
Yes, so housing affordability or, even affordability in general, it's one of the most talked about issues in our country right now, and, for good reason.
Right.
But so much of that conversation was happening without, data or without facts. So we were hearing the same refrain over and over, which is that, rent is too high because housing providers are greedy, and that housing providers are sitting on massive profits. And that's, simply capping rents would solve the problem, right?
Mhm.
And the frustrating thing is that none of that matched the financial reality of our members. What we're hearing from our members, what we know our members are dealing with when it comes to providing safe and habitable housing, none of that matched what our members are living every day.
Mhm.
And so what was missing was a clear, credible answer to a very simple question, which is where does the rent dollar actually go? When I'm asking that question, I'm not talking about theory or, an answer based off of assumptions, but an answer that's actually based off of real data from real properties all across the country. And that's the gap that the dollar rent tool was built to fill. The tool takes tens of thousands of audited operational statements from properties across 43 states and Washington, D.C. It also covers nearly 300 congressional districts and
Mhm.
nearly 100 metro areas. And so it's able to answer that question about where the dollar rent goes with accuracy. And what the data shows consistently is that 89 cents of every rent dollar actually goes towards essential costs before the owner actually sees a dime in return. So,
Mhm.
that 89 cents of every rent dollar, it's keeping the lights on, it's keeping, roofs over residents' heads. It's essentially keeping, the doors open, and there's very little left over.
Right. And let's just dive deeper into those public perceptions about where the dollar really goes, because people in the industry know that rental housing operates on tight margins, in fact, as opposed to public
Yes.
perceptions.
Yeah.
What are the biggest misconceptions about where rent dollars go that this tool is designed to correct?
So the biggest misconception, and you hear this and see this everywhere, is that the rent is mostly profit. And that if rents go up, owners are pocketing the difference.
Right.
And I can understand why people believe that, especially in this environment where, people are paying more for everything. But the data that's provided from the dollar rent tool, it does tell a very different story. So on the national level, profit is only 11 cents on the dollar. So just thinking about what that means, if we were to eliminate that 11-cent profit entirely and, took that to zero, we would have a housing stock that is extremely vulnerable. It can no longer be sustainably maintained or reinvested in, improved. And, when you look at it that way, that is not a solution to solving housing affordability. It is literally putting the housing stock on a path to deterioration. And I would say that the second big misconception is that housing providers can simply just absorb cost increases.
Hmm.
And when, we're talking about insurance costs spiking or property taxes going up, the thought is that owners can just sort of eat those expenses, and they can't. Once again, pointing back to the 11-cent margin, when you're talking about insurance doubling over 3 years, which is exactly what happened, according to our data from the Income Expense IQ from 2021 to 2024, insurance has doubled. And that money, it has to come from somewhere. So when the cost of providing housing increases, owners, they are forced to make very difficult and strategic decisions to keep their residents in their homes. So oftentimes this means that housing providers have to make difficult decisions, and sometimes they'll, need to defer maintenance to offset expense increases. They may even have to reduce services that, might show up in, resident experiences. So
Exactly.
housing providers, they do try to pull from many different levers before they raise rents to offset increases. And I would say for the third misconception is that it's just about who housing providers actually are. So nearly 46% of rental housing homes in the US are actually from small rental properties of 1 to 4 units. And over 70% of the small, rental properties, once again, 1 to 4 units, they're actually owned by individuals. And 70% are managed by what we would call, small mom and pop housing providers. So these are people who own a duplex, a small apartment building, as a part of their retirement savings. They're not corporations, they're our neighbors. And they're operating on these same small, razor thin margins that the data shows.
Are people surprised when they hear that breakdown, 89 cents going toward essential expenses and only 11 cents returned to owners?
Absolutely, absolutely. And once again, because there is that conception that, okay, if you're paying, $1,500 in rent, all of that is going to the owner's pocket. But that's why I love this tool, is because it really does pull back the curtains of what it takes and what's involved in being a housing provider. And it provides the data in a really clear and easy to understand way. So even if you are someone who is not involved or is not a professional within the real estate industry, you can understand, you identify what these costs, what these costs mean. And it's a real opportunity to educate those who are outside of our industry on all the expenses that go into providing apartments.
Hmm. Let's go into the mechanics of the tool. If an owner or property manager visits the site, what can they actually customize? How granular can they get?
So the first thing that you'll notice when you're looking at the dollar rent tool is that there's a geography selector. So you can look at the national data, but you can also drill down to a specific state or go even deeper to a congressional district, or even at the market level. So like I mentioned before, currently the coverage is across 43 states plus Washington, D.C. And we have 286 congressional districts and nearly 100 metro areas. So for anyone doing, advocacy work with an elected official, um, that congressional district view is invaluable, especially right ahead of our annual Advocate conference. This is a tool that's going to be really beneficial for you to be able to go into those meetings with your locally elected official and have the data available at the congressional district. Outside of the geography filter, you can also filter the data by property type. So there's data available for garden style properties, mid-rise, high-rise, senior, student, manufactured, and military housing. You can also filter the data by rent type. So you can see what the dollar rent data looks like at the market rate level versus affordable. And you can also cut the data by property size and property age. I do want to note that not every combination is available for every geography. The data has to be dense enough for it to be statistically meaningful. So we
Mhm.
do require a minimum of 20 properties per segment, but that coverage is deep enough to support most of the conversations our members need to have.
And I also know that the site has a note that the data is based on a sizable sample, as you said earlier, but not the entire rental housing stock. How should users interpret the results responsibly?
This is a very important question, and I'm glad you asked it, Laura. So, the data comes from operating statements tied to federally financed multifamily properties, and that's specifically Freddie Mac CMBS backed loans. So, so that's a large and financially significant segment of the rental housing market, but it's not every rental housing property in America. So small independent landlords who own, a single family rental or two-unit building generally are not highly represented in this data set. So what the data is excellent at representing is the professionally managed apartment sector. So
Mhm.
the properties in the data set are subject to lender oversight and regular financial reporting, which means that the data is audited and verifiable. But these aren't self-reported surveys. They're actually financial documents tied to real loans, which is a much higher standard of data quality than most, industry research relies on. So the responsible framing is that the tool accurately reflects the financial economics of the majority of the rental housing stock, and particularly the segment most likely to be subject to, policy conversations about rent control, rent caps, operating cost regulation. It's not a complete census of every rental housing unit, but it's the most credible, granular data set available on this question.
Right. Are there any specific scenarios that this tool is most powerful that people should be using it in? I don't know, zoning hearings, resident town halls, as you mentioned, conversations around rent control. When would they be using it most?
Yes, so actually all of those scenarios, but they each, are going to use it a little differently, and that versatility is by design. So on the advocacy front, looking at the congressional district overlay, which was very, deliberate for us to be able to provide the dollar of rent at the congressional district. When, one of our members sits down with their representative, they're not just showing the national average, right? They're showing
Mhm.
data that's representative exactly how the dollar rent breaks down by their district. Specific data. It really can change the conversation. It moves from just looking at assumptions about a policy debate to a local economic reality. And then, of
Right.
course, in the rent control arguments and debates, NEA, we're tracking over 100 active rent control bills across the country right now. And so the dollar of rent tool And the findings are, a core piece of that argument about rent control. So, when a city council member says, housing providers can afford a 3% or 5% rent cap, our members, our affiliates can open the tool and show that the 11-cent margin, for their jurisdiction, and actually have the data in the map that speaks for itself. So we hear from our members and our affiliates all the time that the dollar rent data, it is a very strong resource in their advocacy tool bag, especially in jurisdictions considering rent regulation.
And I also know the tool is really helpful for on-site teams dealing with questions about rent increases, rising costs like insurance, taxes, all of that. How can the tool help them communicate more transparently and confidently?
Yes, so this is something that I care deeply about, especially having a background working as a leasing consultant. On-site teams, they are facing the housing industry, the renters the most. They're the ones who are having to field, difficult and hard questions from renters, often without the tools to answer them. So a leasing consultant or, a community manager shouldn't have to say, I'm not sure why the rent has gone up. And they, quite frankly, they shouldn't have to apologize for it either because it's something that is outside of their control.
Right.
And so what the tool gives them is a honest context. So when a resident asks, why their renewal is much higher, the team can explain that, earned insurance costs have increased, and this is the cost for every dollar of rent that goes towards insurance cost, operating costs, taxes, or mortgage. They have the data to explain the breakdown of all the different expenses that need to be covered from a dollar of rent. And so I think that transparency builds trusts. Residents are more understanding when they can see the full picture rather than just some number on their renewal letter. And so for leasing teams, having the data to point to rather than just having to defend a business decision that they might not fully understand themselves, I think that's generally empowering. And I actually receive, multiple requests from property managers asking for the data for this specific purpose, for them to be able to explain, rising rent or, renewal increases to their residents.
And this is extremely important in high tax or high insurance markets. How different does the dollar of rent look in those markets compared to the national average?
Yes, so the variation is quite dramatic, actually, in some areas. And it's one of the most important findings, I think, in the data. The national average, I see it as being a very useful anchor, but it can be completely different when you're looking at what the data looks like at different markets or different states. Looking at property taxes, for example, New Jersey allocates 16 cents for every dollar of rent to taxes. Whereas in Arizona, Nevada, property taxes in these states average about 4 cents of every dollar.
Wow,
Um, yeah, so
quite a
it's
difference.
quite a difference, yes. And so it's really important to be able to have this localized data that truly do tell the story of what our members are experiencing in their states and in their markets that go beyond, that national average. Of course, the insurance data, insurance costs, that's going to fall under the category of operating expenses. And so we definitely see within the data that states that are subject to natural disasters, talking about Florida, Louisiana, just for example, these are states that are going to have a higher operating expense. And so, once again, this is why it's just so important to have data
Mhm.
that shows why federal regulation is very harmful because there is no one size fits all regulatory answer. Every
Exactly.
state and jurisdiction operates differently, and um, they have different levels to their expenses. And so it's just really important to have this data that showcases just how different expenses can be across different geographies.
On that note, have you seen this tool change the tone or substance of conversations with policymakers? Do you have any examples?
Yes, absolutely. So at the federal level, NAA and NMHC, we submitted a joint testimony to the Senate Judiciary's subcommittee on competition and in housing markets, and we explicitly put, that 89 cents of every dollar goes towards expenses into the congressional record. And so that kind of documentation, it really does matter. It becomes part of legislative history that informs future policy. And once again, like I was mentioning, it's just so important that this data, especially reach the federal level, so that it's just clear that once again, that one size fits all regulatory um, decision. It's just clear that there is no one size fits all that will work for all jurisdictions across the country. And we've also seen it work at the local setting too, in local zoning hearings, city council meetings, when, someone from our industry or industry professional, housing provider can walk in with their specific data that represents their jurisdiction and show exactly how much of every rent dollar goes towards expenses and how much is returned as profit. It really does change the posture of that conversation. So, instead of just we oppose this regulation, it becomes here's the financial reality of housing providers in your community,
Right.
and here's what this policy would do to it. And so there's a much more productive conversation that begins to take place. Of course, it doesn't always work, but
Right.
of course, it's just important that this data exists and that our industry does have actual factual data to point to that really do help tell a complete story of our industry.
Yeah, it helps ground debates in data instead of
Exactly.
perception. Mhm.
Yes.
How do you see the dollar of rent tool evolving in the years ahead as operating costs continue to shift, especially insurance, property taxes, and other types of expenditures we've talked about?
Yes, so like I mentioned earlier, we do have a line item within the dollar of rent that basically is an accumulation of different operating expenses. So that's where, insurance costs falls under, maintenance costs falls under there, and a couple other different costs. I can see, especially with how much insurance costs have increased over the years, I can see the value of sort of, taking that that line item of operational expenses and breaking it down so that there is a more granular understanding of exactly how much cents of every dollar goes towards insurance, how much goes towards maintenance expenses. I can absolutely see the value in us providing a more granular breakdown into all the expenses that goes into operating housing. And secondly, it's just more coverage. Like I mentioned, we're at nearly 300 congressional districts. But there's a total of 438. So I would love to be able to provide even more coverage
Mhm.
for the dollar of rent tool.
Thank you so much, Leah, for taking the time to speak with me. I'm sure this was really helpful for everyone listening.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the dollar rent tool.
That's all for today. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear more discussions about the policies, research, and trends shaping the rental housing industry, make sure to follow The Lease Up on your favorite podcast platform. That's where you'll find all of MHN's podcast series, including NAA Insights. You can also stay up to date with the latest news, trends, and industry insights by visiting multihousingnews.com every day. Thanks again for listening. Till next time.